just wait for the last couple of people to connect to the audio and then we'll kick off. Right, maybe Rick is not connecting to the audio. Well, welcome along everybody to our fortnightly Zoom session. Brief introductions again. My name's Brig, if you haven't got my name yet. So I'm the local consulting officer for Huntly to Tapanui. I've also got Lizzie Moore, who does Cambridge area, and then she's going to do a bit more of an introduction on our guest speaker, senior scientist for DairyNZ, Paul Edwards, as well. So as per usual, we're pretty well briefed on the Zoom etiquette, but if you can be on mute, we'd love to see your faces so we can see who we're talking to if possible, but understand if you don't want to do that. And once again, we will be live streaming to the Waikato DairyNZ Facebook page. So I'm just getting that set up now as well. If you want to chuck any questions up there, more than welcome to put them in the chat box, or there is the raise your hand option if you'd like to actually ask the question verbally rather than typing it. I know sometimes it's a challenge to type it all in. So the format of these 1 hour sessions fortnightly, and with that I'm going to keep adding this to Facebook and hand over to Lizzie to introduce our guest speaker.
Thanks, Brig. So today or tonight we've got Paul Edwards joining us. He's sitting down there in the Lincoln DairyNZ office. He's a senior scientist with DairyNZ, and he's the lead in this trial where we're looking at the 3-in-2 milking frequency. So the researchers investigating the people, animal and pasture response to milking 3 times in 2 days. So many of you have probably experienced maybe 16-hour milkings. So this is a bit of extra to that, to have milkings that are a bit more at a better time of day, because I do hear farmers say when the 16-hour milkings, the 8 o'clock at night or 10 o'clock at night is not such a good one. So yeah, wanting healthier people and cows, and that started in July 2019, and the project is running for 3 years. So it's to make sure that the project goals for farmers and advisors to have confidence to adopt the and optimise the 3-in-2 milkings, enhanced wellbeing, so less hours spent working on farm and greater flexibility, because we realise on a farm about 50% of our time is actually spent milking cows. So if we can take away one of those milkings and free up 25% of time, I think that could be a good thing. And hopefully increasing that economic sustainability in the business, and maybe being able to use extra people to help on farm and outsource milkings to maybe people that haven't been able to milk in the past because the hours don't suit, i.e. school hours. Yeah, so I'll hand over to Paul to tell us a bit about you, to start with, Paul, and then get into what you guys have been researching and trialling down there in Lincoln.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so well, I won't spend too long introducing myself, other than I've been with DairyNZ for 11 or 12 years now. I was originally based in Waikato, but I've been down here in Canterbury for the last 5-6 years. Yeah, researched a few different topics now. Farm systems, I guess, takes you to a few different places, but have spent quite a bit of that time looking at the milking efficiency / labour efficiency kind of thing. Originally, yeah, mum and dad dairy farming up in Northland, so I've got that sort of farming context as well. So flexible milking, I guess I kind of like to frame it up with why are we interested in it, and I think it really centres around this question: can we adapt milking intervals to improve our workplace attractiveness? There is a number of other reasons that Lizzie touched on there as to why, but I think for the project anyway, this is kind of a central one, and that's obviously both from an hours perspective. We spend a lot of time milking, But I think the one that's often underrated is that flexibility element. I think particularly as generations change, and certainly something we hear that is quite attractive to millennials, is really around that flexibility to be able to, head off into town when they want, or that kind of thing, which, yeah, when you've got two milkings at kind of in the start and end of the day, that very much defines the structure of that day. Whereas, can we mix that up a bit to allow more options? Another, just I guess, background to get started with is looking at what the industry is doing at the moment. So this was from a survey of normally it's every year, it's normally 500 farms, but it was cut short this year with COVID, so they only got 333 done. But yeah, nationally, around 45% of herds were milked full season twice a day, which I think is less than what some people think. We kind of always think of ourselves as twice a day being the norm, but it is actually less than half now. There was 14% that were using 3 and 2 at some stage of the lactation. 31% were using once a day for part of that lactation, and 8% using full season once a day. And that the twice a day was reasonably similar between North and South Island, but with a greater use of 3 and 2 in the South Island. And when we look a bit further into some of that regional variation, well, there is some regional variation there. So regions like Northland, where around a quarter to a third of the herds are full season once a day, through to some of the Canterbury, Southland, where there is no full season once a day is reasonably few farms doing that, but a much greater use of that 3 and 2 milking strategy. And I think the next slide I'll get to will kind of help explain some of the background to why that is. And just one more piece there, looking at those that are for that part season use, when's it happening? So for that 31% that are using part season once a day, around half of them are doing it right from Christmas, the other half doing it in later lactation, and the same for 3 and 2, that 14% there that we're using part season 3 and 2, around half were doing it from Christmas, and half were doing it in that later lactation. And there was a group there, that 9% at the bottom, that were using it in different ways, essentially. So they may have used once a day over calving and then gone twice a day, or they may have only had this one herd on once a day, or 3 and 2, etc. So yeah, just different combinations. So talking about flexible milking, the project is around 3 and 2 because that's where there's sort of has been a knowledge gap. But I think it's always a good place to start with once a day, because that's kind of the ultimate when it comes to flexibility. But the first question there people always ask is, okay, what's that going to do to my production? What's going to be that cost? And so this is a graph from a couple of years ago now. There's around 300 herds sit behind this data set. So these are commercial herds that have already adopted full season once a day milking, and I've plotted their performance from 4 years prior to going once a day. Year 0 is their first season of once a day, and then 5 seasons of once a day there, essentially, and grouped them by their once a day level of milk production. So herds that were doing 250 milk solids per cow or less, they actually increased production when they went once a day, which physiologically doesn't make a lot of sense, but it, to me, says they were overcoming some management limitation there. The next line up, there was a bit of a decrease in that year 1, but reasonably quickly regained their previous level of production. And as you move further up that the levels there, there was a greater cost and not necessarily regained in future years. Now, there could be, of course, a number of reasons behind that. For example, a farm system change where they've gone from a system 4 to system 2 or something, which would explain why they didn't get back to their higher level of production. However, what is clear is that there is a greater cost that even in the first year anyway would need to be overcome. but I'll kind of build on that in a second. Those bottom two categories, there's actually around a fifth to a quarter of the industry sit in those two categories. So there's a lot more farms out there that I would say could be benefiting from full season once a day than are currently using it. That next group, that yellow group, there's about 20% of the industry sits in that category, and I'd put them as a maybe. You know, there is a bit of a production cost there, but potentially, depending on their farm, may be able to offset that. Whereas then, those higher producing categories, I think once a day is going to be harder to justify anyway. And I think that does explain that regional variation that we saw on the previous slide there. Like, for example, Northland, the average production is 320, 330 milk solids per cow. So that says that there's a lot of herds in those first two categories there, that it's a reasonably low barrier to go full season once a day. So yeah, building on that, why 3 and 2? We know it's a suitable strategy for many farms, many more than are currently using it, but it's going to be harder to justify for those high producing herds and all the ones with less ability to reduce costs. So, you know, I guess that whatever level of production that once a day decreases by, you'd need to be offsetting the costs if you wanted to maintain profit. And for some farms, that's going to be harder to do. We also know from some earlier research that milk secretion is linear up to about that 16 to 18 hour mark. That graph over there is. So I guess that's where the original theory of 16-hour milking came from. This was sort of what I'd say call component research. So it was a very controlled environment because you need to make sure the cows don't let their milk down and things like that. So it wasn't tested in a system. So we don't necessarily know what the effect, for example, of consecutive long intervals might be. We had that group of, there's that 14% of the industry that are already using 3 and 2, and they were starting to ask us the question, well, actually, using this knowledge, can 3 and 2 actually play a greater role in our farm system? So using it from earlier in the lactation or even the full season. And so that's what led to this 3-year Sustainable Farming Fund project. So it's about 50% funded by MPI, about 30% by DairyNZ, and then some in-kind contributions from other parties. And so, yeah, as Lizzie said, the goal is increasing the confidence of farmers to optimise, adopt and support the use of 3 and 2 milking, with the ultimate goal of that hours kind of side of things, the enhanced wellbeing on farm. Over the 3 years, the first season we ran a farmlet experiment, which I'll explain in a bit. We also did some farmer interviews. So the idea behind the experiment was to provide some sort of some hard numbers behind what farmers could expect from using it at different stages of lactation. Then we also did some interviews with farmers that were already using it to capture, I guess, why they had adopted it, what they had learned, what had gone well, what hadn't, what questions did they still have, etc., etc. And that would sort of guide the direction of the project to an extent, and what resources we need to develop as part of that. So this season, using that information, create some resources, which I'll finish on at the end of the presentation. The hope was, by doing that farm experiment, providing some hard numbers, we'd be able to find some commercial farms that were happy to actually give that full season 3 and 2 milking a go, and let us follow their journey. And then there was another experiment there testing about the how much flexibility we have with those milkings, which I'll also touch on. And yeah, and I guess a kind of a wrap up here, and an opportunity to try and tidy up questions that we hadn't already answered. So onto that farmlet experiment. So what we did, so there was for herds that milk twice a day, we used a 10 and 14 hour milking interval. So, that's our traditional kind of twice a day time. For the 3 and 2 herds, we chose 5 a.m., 5 p.m., 11 a.m., so 12, 18, 18. As I think we mentioned before, the kind of origins of this is 16-hour milk intervals, equal 16-hour intervals, which is where the 16-hour name came from, but that did get a bit of a bad rep. Some people like it, but it seemed like the majority of people didn't like that, particularly that late night milking. And so over time, that evolved to 14, 16, 18, and now 12, 18, 18 is the most common interval people were using, and that's why we chose to test this in the farmlets. We stocked at 3.5 cows a hectare. It's run down at the Lincoln University Research Dairy Farm. We did have 29% heifers, which is not deliberate. We used all of the cows on the farm, and the farm has a history of not great reproductive performance, so we kind of had to take what we could there, but I guess perhaps keep that in mind with context to the results. We had 11 paddocks per farmlet, which means after balance day, the herd spent 2 days per paddock and got a fresh break after each milking. So that meant that we could keep the 3 and 2 and the twice a day herds quite similar. Essentially, the only difference was the 3 and 2 herd had 3 breaks over those 2 days. The twice a day herd had 4 breaks over those 2 days, and that gave us our 22-day round. We had 4 herds. We had a full season 3 and 2 herd. We had one that switched to 3 and 2 on 1st of December, and I guess those ones are the 2 that were probably of most interest. We had obviously full season twice a day as our control, and 3 and 2 from 1st of March, which I guess there's already a group of farmers using that system. Each farmlet had the same management decision rules. Now, that's not to say that the farmlets were managed identically. It just meant that the same sort of framework was used. So, for example, we could have fed supplement at different stages of depending on the herd's needs or the farmlet's needs. We could have dried off at different times, culled at different times, etc. The reality is, generally, the decision all came at the same time for each of the herds, probably because they're all the same stocking rate. That's what drives a lot of those decisions. So yeah, they all got the same amount of nitrogen. Pasture growth was similar, potentially slightly more in those earlier 3 and 2 treatments. This one's just some raw numbers, raw averages. I haven't actually had the time to analyse these statistically yet, but potentially could be some more growth there. Reasonably consistent amount of supplement fed and silage made, or at least when you look at the net difference between the groups there. So on to the kind of numbers that everyone wants to hear about. It's the first question people ask. So I've got it there in text as well as graphically for those people that think in that way. So essentially what that's saying is, so the twice a day herd, they did about 460 milk solids a cow. If you look at the graph, that green line at the top, you can see that 457. And for every day of 3 and 2, there was a 0.09 kilo of milk solids per cow per day decrease. So that meant over the full season 3 and 2 herd, there was a 5% decrease over that whole lactation. For the one that switched on 1st of December, the average was 3%. For the one that was 1st of March, it was 1%. Interestingly, which we'll sort of get onto a bit later on, fat was less affected than protein. So the fat production largely was unaffected by 3 and 2. It was the protein production that was driving that decrease, which is, I guess, useful to keep in mind, particularly depending on who you're supplying your milk to. But at the moment, for a lot of the milk processors, fat is worth more than protein, which means a 5% decrease in milk solids maybe only 4.5% decrease in revenue or something like that. You'd have to do the calculations for your own processor. I guess a couple of things to note there. It was a full season experiment, but it was only 1 year, so potentially there's some carryover effects that could come through, which I'll touch on in a minute, like for example condition score. The other thing to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned before, the farmlets were all managed using the sort of same set of rules, and I like to think managed reasonably well. So on a commercial farm, if you're freeing up time by not spending time in the dairy, and you're able to use that time to make better management decisions or more optimal, timely management decisions, then you may also be able to offset some of that difference as well, which we wouldn't see necessarily in this experiment. So the other one I was just going to touch on from the experiment. So this is the condition score from the 8th of May. We dried off on about the 10th or 11th of May, which was a little bit earlier than we'd hoped. This farm would normally dry off about the 20th of May, but well, like much of the rest of the country, we had a pretty poor summer and autumn, and even though there was irrigation, there's no substitute for rain. So this farm anyway, in particular with its soils, really struggled through that sort of late summer, autumn period. So you dried off about the 10th of May. But on the 8th of May, when we did that condition score, the full season 3 and 2 herd was about a quarter of a condition score more than the twice a day, the full season twice a day herd, with those other two treatments being in the middle. So thinking about what I mentioned before about just a 1 year experiment, well, in theory then in the next season, you would expect that that condition score would be worth something to you, whether that be in better production early in the season or I guess potentially benefiting from or helping with improved reproductive performance. So I think, that was kind of, I guess, the headline numbers anyway from the farmlet experiment, and that sort of segues, I think, reasonably nicely into the next experiment that I mentioned, which was around the timing of those milkings. So as I mentioned, we've moved from 16, 16, 16, 14, 16, 18, 12, 18, 18. It's become more attractive, but even for 12, 18, 18, it can still make for a long day, particularly on smaller farms where it's more difficult to roster around it. A larger farm, one person might be doing the morning milking, the separate person might be doing the afternoon milking, whereas if you're doing both, then that 12-hour day, I mean, sure, you can take a few hours off in the middle, but it can kind of feel like you're on farm for a long time anyway. So that's the second experiment is really set up to look at, is it the number of milkings, i.e. 3 times in 2 days or an average of 1.5 per day, or is it the timing of those milkings that's really the driver of that milk production difference? So we set up a 6-week experiment. We've actually, this one ran from the 11th of September through to the 22nd of October. The cows were 33 days in milk at the start of that period, and we had 5 herds of 40 cows. This was like the idea here was a peak lactation 6-week snapshot, although probably you could argue this is slightly on the earlier side of peak. And then the plan is to repeat this experiment again over the January through to March period to see mid-lactation if the results are still the same. So our 5 herds, we had one was twice a day, 10 and 14. Just to sort of illustrate the difference here. The second herd was 3 and 2, milked with that 12, 18, 18 hour interval. So I guess that it was there to relate to the farmlet experiment that we did last season. We had a 10, 19, 19 hour herd and an 8, 20, 20 hour herd. So as you can see, the effect of changing those intervals is that you drag that, you either drag that afternoon milking earlier or potentially you could start later as well. I've just kept them all at 5 AM for argument's sake here. And it also drags in that day 2, that morning milking, which from talking to farmers also seems attractive. While 11 AM may give you a nice sleep in, the reality is if your body clock's set to get up to a certain time, then you don't necessarily get to benefit from that. And it seems people prefer to have that milking a little bit earlier, so you kind of free up that whole day to go and get tasks done, and then maybe knock off early the end rather than having that time at the start. And then the 5th herd, just for context, was a once a day herd. So we've got that kind of control at each end of the spectrum to see where these 3 and 2 intervals sit in between. Now, for ease of comparison, I just drew them all at 5 AM as the starting point, but obviously all the herds were running in the same on the same farm. They were actually all in the same paddock, just the paddock was separated into 5 breaks, so the idea was try and feed them exactly the same, which did mean that the milkings there was a half-hour gap between each herd to get them into the dairy, essentially. So if we start with looking at secretion rate, so if we break each of those intervals down individually, that was the graph I put up right back at the start. That kind of, I guess, led to this idea. If we plot what we got from this experiment, we get the same sort of story, which is good. That's what we want to see. So, a reasonably straight line at the start and then curving off as for those more extended kind of intervals. That's for milk yield. For protein yield, same kind of thing. So it follows much the same shape as milk yield. They're reasonably well correlated. And then fat production is reasonably linear in terms of its production, which again, you think back to those farm results, fat production was less affected than protein. Well, this is why, because essentially the cows produce, give or take, are producing pretty much the same amount of fat no matter what interval you're using. So the good news is that stacks up with some early literature. This was a study done back in the 60s actually, but it's probably the most comparable to what we've done here. And that one, if we look at milk, same sort of thing, reasonably linear, then curving off. Solids, not fat, i.e. protein. Similar trend, whereas fat production was pretty consistent. There's a small cost there to using long consecutive intervals. So just take that 8-20-20 treatment, for example. So those are the 2 20-hour intervals that you can see there. And so the mid morning interval is the top one and the AM interval is the bottom one. So if you think about the 8, there's been 8 hours between AM and PM, and then that first long interval, that's the mid interval. So, and then it's the AM is the second one. So 2 consecutive long intervals. There is that's what's driving some of that difference, if that makes sense. Which is interesting. I guess from using that knowledge, you could potentially, instead of using even intervals like we did, it may be slightly more beneficial to use the longer interval following the short interval. So you do, I don't know, for example, 8, 22, 18 or something like that. Maybe there's some, that may be slightly advantageous. Not sure, but a theory. One other thing just to point out there, that dot that I've drawn an arrow to there, that's the 14-hour interval of twice a day. And the dot, for whatever reason, is below where we would expect to see it based on that regression line. And as we'll see on the next slide, that has affected some of the results, which we'll talk through in a minute. So I guess what does all that mean when you bring it all together, which is probably really of most interest to you guys. So if I plot milk yield or milk volume for the different groups there, we can see, as we'd expect, once a day they did the lowest, so they were doing 18.5 kilos per day. The twice a day group was doing just over 23. These letters up the top here, those are indicating statistical difference. So if the letter is different, then it's statistically different. So saying each of those once a day, 3 and 2, and twice a day are different from each other, but there's no statistical difference between those 3 and 2 treatments. There is a numerical difference there, however. If we look at protein yield, we see much the same thing as, again, as we've seen from those previous slides, that we would expect that the protein yield is reasonably correlated with milk yield. When we put up fat yield, again, it's largely what we'd expect to see. So basically the same level of fat production across all of the different treatments, except for twice a day. As I mentioned, that 14-hour interval, for whatever reason, the number didn't seem like it matched the rest of them, which then, once we plot milk solids yield, means that we don't actually, statistically, there's no difference between any of the treatments, which on the one hand probably is too good to be true a little bit. We know that there is a difference between once a day and twice a day, for example. But if we use that regression line that I drew on the previous slide, if we use the equation that's behind that to suggest what perhaps that twice a day number should have been, if you use that regression line, it does actually bring the twice a day fat production very much in line with what we'd expect to see, and it brings that twice a day production up to about that 2 milk solids mark, which probably, if you use that number, there would then be a statistical difference between once a day and twice a day, and the 3 and 2 would be probably not different from either. They would sit in the middle. The other reason we may not have seen as big a difference with the once a day who produced really well and the study, and the 3 and 2 who did as well. I guess one reason for that could be because they had spent the first month of their lactation on twice a day. Unlike, if you'd started the treatment right back at the start, then we may have seen a number closer to the farmlets. So if we compare the 12, 18, 18 with the twice a day, there's very little difference there, whereas we did see that 0.09 difference with the farmlets. So it could be driven by the fact they started off twice a day. So anyway, I guess back to that question that we were trying to answer with this experiment. Looking at these results, my conclusion from it would be that there is a small cost to using more attractive milking times with 3 and 2, but it's statistically insignificant. So I guess, based on that, it's a matter of sitting down and working out for your own situation whether that's likely to be worth it to you or not.
So Paul, can I just jump in with just a clarifying question that's come?
Yes.
That milk yield one, the y-axis label, that's milk yield in litres, isn't it? Not kilograms.
Yeah, well, it is actually kilos. I mean, because the milk meter actually weighs milk rather than, it's not a flow meter. So the units are kilos, but milk, getting really technical here, but the milk, the specific gravity of milk is 1.03 kilos. So basically 1 kilo of milk equals 1 litre of milk. So they're virtually identical.
Cool. And then we did actually get a question that came in earlier that on the Facebook from someone who can't attend tonight, but Oz, I think this relates to this, so maybe you can just clarify the answer based on these results. So Oz tried 12, 18, 18 last year and was thinking of using 16, 16, 16 this year. Your thoughts on the gut feel of production difference between the two options is that there shouldn't be much? Look,
I would say yes, there will be, as in the 16, 16, 16 is when you look at, particularly if you look at milk yield, I would say that there would definitely be a difference in milk yield. When you start adding in the component stuff, then that difference will shrink essentially. So I would say probably there is a very marginal benefit to being 16, 16, 16 would be my take.
Cool. Thanks for that, Paul.
So I guess just sort of largely wrapping up, I've just got a couple of slides left. Just wanted to, I guess, touch on some of the more softer stuff around these different intervals. So obviously twice a day, 10 and 14 is kind of our control. You know, that's an industry what we've done for a long time. Even if you don't want to use 3 and 2 or once a day, even within twice a day, we've got flexibility with what milking intervals that we use. So research as early as the 1950s suggested that we could be using an 8 and 16 hour interval with twice a day. So, you know, get up 2 hours earlier, finish 2 hours earlier, give yourself an hour either side, etc. You know, there's options there. One of the drawbacks people mention is getting less done in the day because you've got, you know, a shorter period between milkings. Now, I mean, yes, that could happen. But I think it's a matter of sitting down as a farm team and saying, well, look, if this is what we want to do, we still need to make sure we get everything done. How are we going to make that happen? I don't think it has to be a barrier to using an 8 and 16-hour interval. It does mean, though, that there's a lot of milk to harvest that morning at milking, you know, potentially twice as much as the afternoon. So it does mean that morning milking could really drag out if we don't have good milking routines, essentially. So thinking back to some of the milk smart messages that you may have heard over the years in terms of getting things optimised in the dairy. With 3 and 2, we start opening up more of those flexibility options. So you know, every second day there's a milking that occurs outside of those traditional milking windows. So as I think Lizzie mentioned before, you know, suddenly there's a whole lot of people that are living rurally that you know, they're only available between 9 and 3 because they have to go and pick the kids up. Well, actually now every second day they could be being employed as a milker, which particularly in current circumstances where there is less migrant workers in the country, you know, increasing that pool of available labour could be quite useful for some people. A drawback, well, sorry, I'll cover off the other benefit, obviously results in 25% fewer milkings than twice a day. One of the drawbacks that there is that 3 and 2 has a fortnightly cycle to it. So when it comes to planning, you know, you get invited to a barbecue in 3 weeks' time, you don't know based on the day of the week necessarily whether you have 2 milkings or 1 milking. You have to also know which week it is, and so it does make some of that. For some people, they're not worried about it at all. Others like to kind of have that certainty of knowing which day of the week it is and you know, how many milkings they've got. Which is where this concept of 10 and 7 has kind of come from and seems to be generating a lot of interest with farmers, I think, for obvious reasons. Basically, it's 3 and 2, but then on Sunday, instead of having 2 milkings, so Monday, Wednesday, Friday would be your normal milkings with normal days with 2 milkings, and then Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday have the 1 milking, and then on Sunday under 3 and 2 that would go back to 2 milkings. On 10 and 7 on that Sunday there's just that you stick with the 1 milking as well. So you end up with a slightly, I think it average depends on what times you use, but it averages out to about a 21 or 22 hour interval over that Sunday. Advantages, obviously you've got 1 milking each day on the weekend, and it also locks in those consistent weeks, so you do know based on the day of the week how many milkings you can expect, and with that you end up with 29% fewer milkings. And then obviously the ultimate once a day, you know, potentially you can milk any time during the day. I think most farmers have stuck with a morning milking, but again, thinking back to that, increasing the pool of available labour, there's nothing to stop you milking at 9:30 or something like that to access that pool of available labour. I've also heard of people milking at 3 p.m, particularly over calving, so they get all their calving tasks kind of done in the morning and then finish off with that milking at the end of the day. So I guess just summarising what we've talked about there. So bringing it back to that question, can we improve workplace attractiveness by adjusting our milking intervals? There's lots of options available. I think the farmlet results looking quite encouraging for full season. 5%, that's not insignificant, but I think there's ways of probably reducing that slightly, and then obviously I think for a lot of farmers, there is the ability to offset that through other changes. So we asked at a webinar we ran back in back in March. We asked a question of the audience, what did that number mean to them? And I think there was only 15% that said, no, that's too much for me. The others were either in the group of, yep, I could make that work with pretty minor changes. I could make that work, although I'd have to make some major changes. Or there was also a group that sort of said, well, I'm happy just to accept 5% for a better lifestyle. So reasonably few people that thought that would be too much to overcome. I think the latest study is saying that it is definitely possible to use these more attractive milking times. There may be a small additional cost to it, but probably in the grand scheme of things is reasonably small. Two other things, I guess, that came out of those farmer interviews, which I didn't really talk about, but the advice that came through from there was really making sure you understand your why that you're adopting these intervals, and then really make a good plan in advance to make sure that you achieve that goal, because I think it would probably be not a good plan just to change milking frequency and nothing else. I think there's a risk that you wouldn't necessarily achieve your goal, or you may end up with an outcome that is less desirable. And yeah, just to finish off, drawing people's attention to the website. So DairyNZ.co.nz in the milking section. There's now there's a few different pages there on milking intervals, right from the twice a day, once a day. We've added some new pages now around 3 and 2, including this one, which is implementing 3 and 2. So some of those more practical questions, which we've set it up as an FAQ. And so if you expand each of those sections, there's some information there. We definitely don't have all the answers yet, but I think it's a reasonably good start there, and always keen to hear feedback in terms of what questions there are still to answer there, or what you think might be missing or could be refined on. So yeah, that's me. Any other questions there, Brig?
Yep. So I'll get Lizzie to check the Facebook page to see if anyone's put any questions. But Oz asked another couple of questions. So he was entertaining just milking twice a day if the milkings clashed with things on in the evening or day. What's your gut feel around changing the routine from 16 hours back to twice a day, back to 16 hours?
My observation of cow behaviour would be that they are creatures of habit, so they do like routine, and I think they do settle into this 3 and 2 milking routine. It does take them a few days, but they do settle into it. So I guess changing it up like that potentially is a little bit disruptive to that routine. However, I do think they're also quite adaptable animals as well, much more so than we give them credit for a lot of the time. So I would think that probably it's okay to do that. Certainly I wouldn't think it's going to hurt them. They might be a bit miffed, and they might complain a bit about it. But the idea of 13 milkings a week, so dropping a milking in the weekend, that's been around for a long time, which is a similar kind of concept, and cows seem to get on fine with that. So why wouldn't they in that situation as well?
Mm. And final question, from a production point of view, are there certain cows that are outliers? For instance, would a high volume Friesian cow be more affected in the 3 and 2 versus a Jersey cow with high milk percentage? So cow specific?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't know the answer to that question. We haven't done anything looking at breeds specifically. With once a day there is, so the research there suggests Jerseys are more tolerant of once a day than Friesians. I'm not sure whether that's something magical about the Jersey cow, or whether that's just a trait that is suited to once a day that is more, expresses itself more frequently in Jerseys. Because there are plenty of Friesian once a day herds out there that seem to be doing things quite well. So it's not sort of you can only do it this way or that way. I think there's both. But that was the concept of 3 and 2, that, can we get some of the benefits of once a day essentially without some of that production loss, particularly thinking about the South Island herds, were they the ones really asking the questions, and of which the majority of them are sort of F12 on average. And that's the kind of cow, both of these experiments will run with cows that were about that F11, F12 kind of animal. Yeah, so I don't know if that exactly answered the question, but there's definitely going to be cow-to-cow variation, that much is certain.
Cool. Yeah, I think that answers the question. Go, Liz.
There's a few questions up here in the chat. What about milking colostrum cows once a day? What do you?
Anything specific about it, or that farmlet experiment, both the twice a days and the 3 and 2s were milked. The colostrums were milked once a day. It seems like it's a pretty popular practice these days. Anecdotally, I'd imagine maybe it could be as high as a quarter or a third of farms are doing it. Certainly, at least down here in Canterbury, it seems to be pretty common practice. In terms of what the cost might be, we haven't done anything for a while on that. I do recall some earlier numbers, though, that suggested there may be about a 1% effect on production from doing colostrums once a day. It's hard to answer, isn't it? Because it's quite a short period of once a day, so you need large numbers of animals to pick up any statistical differences, because you're looking for very minute differences, if that makes sense.
And then there was another one. What's the effect on milk withholding of drugs on the 3 and 2?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. There is an answer in the FAQ there. It's probably one that I'm hoping we can improve the answer on over the next year. The short answer is you need vet approval. To the letter of the law, you need vet approval to use any of these drugs on 3 and 2, because you are, the labels are, for most of them, is twice a day. Some of them have once a day labels as well. So using it in 3 and 2 is going off label, which the default of going off label is a 35-day withhold. Now, most vets were happy to approve it lower, but you do have to get their approval to do that. And there's definitely some things to think through around some that short acting versus long acting, and what intervals that you're actually using, and etc. So probably hard to give more specific advice than that, other than needing to work through a plan with the vet, but that it shouldn't be a barrier to going 3 and 2.
Okay, and then sorry, just back to about milking colostrum cows once a day. When you say a 1% drop, is that 1% drop for the year, or just while they're on once a day?
That was for the year, but like I said, the experiment wasn't an experiment, if that makes sense. It was just collecting some data off some farms that had done it, and when you're trying to look at really small differences like that, there could be other factors involved, if that makes sense. You need probably a reason why it hasn't really been done more thoroughly is you need quite a big experiment, I guess, and then have to have those animals all the way through the lactation to really see what the difference is, if that makes sense.
I know anecdotally, just from talking to farmers that have done it, once they've done it, they don't want to go back.
Yeah, look, and that's what that's what I hear as well. So
yeah. And there's another question here. Were there differences in the somatic cell count for the different treatments in the latest trials that you did?
There were no differences in that last one. There was, the once a day herd had slightly higher cell count. There was no difference between 3 and 2 and twice a day. With that farmlet study, if I remember rightly, there was a small difference. So it's slightly higher with 3 and 2, probably driven by the volume difference. So for the farmlets, if we just talk about that full season 3 and 2 herd, 5% difference in milk solids. I think it was about 10% difference in milk yield. So that volume was less, which obviously cell count is cells per mil. So you drop the volume, the cell count itself is going to go up a little bit. But yeah, again, nothing to say that should be a barrier to using 3 and 2, if that makes sense. We know it can work with once a day. 3 and 2 is just sitting somewhere in the middle as a worst case scenario, probably sitting closer to twice a day. Having said that, one of the FAQs in there is around, just looking at what it's called there. How do I manage my somatic cell count and tanker scheduling? There's a question in there. There is differences between the different intervals in their cell counts, and it is opposite to what we'd expect. So farmers seeing that if we just take the 12, 18, 18 as an example, if you're, depending on when your tanker's coming, there's different milkings, and unless you're on skip a day, in which case it's consistent, but if you're on daily pickup, depending on when that tanker's come, you have different milkings in the vat. That 12-hour interval has a higher cell count than the 2 18-hour intervals. So if the tanker comes in the morning, then like before that midday, or before that 11 a.m. milking, if it comes between, let's say 5 a.m. and 11 a.m., every second day it'll only be picking up that 12-hour interval milking, just the PM milking, and that will have a higher cell count associated with it. So don't be surprised if that one, if it spikes a bit on that one. I guess if you're a herd that is already reasonably high, if you're thinking about using 3 and 2 in later lactation, and your cell count's already at 250, then when you just pick up that single high cell count milking, you could be getting up there, I guess, with as you get later in lactation. So something to think, keep in mind. The way around it is to try and change your tanker scheduling. So either if it's coming between the 11 a.m. and the PM milking, or if it's coming overnight, then that problem disappears to a large extent. Because the other downside to having it coming at that morning interval, at that morning window, is so on one day you only have the PM milking in the vat, which means that the other day you have the 2 18-hour milkings in the vat, which if you're on daily pickup because of your vat capacity, if you're doing it through spring, actually your vat may be hitting capacity. So I guess practical things to think about.
All right, that's pretty good. Oh, just so we don't need to milk the cows Christmas afternoon. Is that what you're saying?
I think that would be reasonably safe, and has been done many a time already in the past without me saying that that's okay to do.
Cool. Brig, I'll hand over to you.
Awesome. So thank you very much, Paul. I think if there's any other questions, people should chuck them in there. But do you want to give a little plug, Paul, to the newsletter that people can sign up to? Yeah, good thinking, actually. Yeah, so if you do head onto the website, under the, I think even if you just go dairynz.co.nz/3 and 2, should take you to the project page. There's a link there you can sign up to. Every fortnight there's a newsletter that goes out. So last year it was a fortnight update from the farmlets. This year we've got fortnight updates going out from the pilot farms. So the 3 that are we're following a bit more closely, they get visited every
every 6 weeks, so 3 of them every fortnight. There's an update from one of the farms that goes out that's got some sort of headline farm physical information, not, it's not really detailed, but enough to kind of get an idea of what's happening on the farm. But I think the commentary is the bit that people are most interested in hearing about what they've learned, or how the 3 and 2's been working for them. So head on to that web page and you can sign up to receive those updates and any more that come through. So at some point, probably in the next month, I'll try and get an update out about that, the latest intervals experiment.
And I think what we might do is we'll put a link on the Facebook in the comments in the Facebook page for people to just click straight into the DairyNZ 3 and 2 page to help with that. But yeah, just wanted to say a massive thank you to Paul for tuning in from the Lincoln office today and giving us that summary. Some key things that I sort of picked up today. Only 45% are actually full season twice a day. That sort of, I would have thought it was higher than that. So I'm in that category of people who are surprised by that. That second farmlet study that you've started now, incredibly interesting, and definitely looking forward to hearing what happens later on in the season when you get to January. So yeah, it's been really fascinating, and certainly something that I'm getting the fortnightly updates on, just tracking what's going on, and there's a lot of interest in the Waikato. So I've already received a couple of texts of people asking where they can watch this. So it's really fascinating stuff, and I think the key thing that this year has highlighted is we do need to try and make our workplaces more attractive so that we can sort of have these flexible workspaces to enable us to get the staff that we need to help us run our dairy farms. So thanks again to everybody for tuning in, and thanks once again, Paul, for presenting today. Cheers.